Greetings, Steiners, and welcome to another edition of the Snack Card Gourmet here on the Doomstead Diner. If you recall, last week we discovered a couple of beautiful ribeye steaks, prime cut at Three Bears Market. There you go, have a look, beautiful. And I was going to cook them up last week, but unfortunately my health got in the way. And I wasn't entirely sure that I would actually get to this Snack Card Gourmet episode. But I'm still here, and so are the steaks. I put them in the freezer over the weekend and defrosted them today, and they're none the worse for wear. They still look pretty good. We have two of them, and I'm going to do two different preparations. One's more or less an outdoor preparation. The other one's an indoor, more of an indoor prep. Both preparations could be done by the Snap Card homeless person, as long as you have some cookware to work with. And what do you call it? The flavors are somewhat different, and it comes out, different. Gives you good variety in your ribeye. And for me, ribeye is a favorite cut to cook. And these ribeyes actually look so good that you could eat them tartare. You could eat them raw. If you cut away the fat and so forth. But the fat, to me, is the best part. I wouldn't want to do that with ribeyes, generally speaking. Okay, so the first one we're going to do is a dry rub for outdoor cooking on the grill. And before we actually get into that part of it, I want to discuss knives, because knives are just about as important a part of cooking as your spices and everything else. You want to have good ones to work with, depending on what you're doing. And these days, of course, you have food processors and blenders and other things that can make your cooking life easier than with a knife. But overall, a good basic knife is what you want to have in your stock. And the most important thing with a knife is that it's sharp. And there are lots of means of keeping your knife sharp. A good old-fashioned sharpening stone is one of them. And I have some other sharpening devices in here somewhere, but I never use them. So, I don't know where they are. I thought they were right up at top, but they're not. But they have the angles all done up for you, so you don't have to be so proficient with the sharpening stone. But it's just a good practice to sharpen your knife after you finish washing and everything, so it's ready for the next episode of cooking. One of my most prized gifts that I ever got from my ex-wife was a 10-inch chef's knife made by Henkel's. That was in the days when Henkel's still produced their steel in Germany before they moved their plants to China. Henkel's steel from China is still pretty good, and so is some of the other Chinese steel as well. I don't want to diss the Chinese too much on their steel. At least they're still making it, right? Anyway, the 10-inch chef's knife is the chef's most important weapon in his cooking. And you want a good one of these. And this one is made by Hampton Forge. That's another Chinese company that's not too bad. Another recent variety of knife is the Sudoku knife. That's a Japanese variety. And this one is real good for a sort of a combination of a chopping knife and a slicing knife. And it has these little ridges in it that keep it from gripping to the food, and that's a handy thing also. And then I also like to have a paring or boning knife around. That's a small knife that lets you dig into little corners and cut away cartilage and stuff like that. So you want one of those around as well. So have good knives available. All right. After the knives comes your choice of cutting boards, because you have to cut up your stuff on something. You don't want to cut up your beautiful Formica counters that are made from oil. And you have a couple of choices on these now also. You have your traditional, the wooden cutting board, and then you have your more modern plastic variety. Now, you might think that since I'm not a big fan of all the products of the Age of Oil, that I would be totally in favor of the wooden cutting board, which I am for the most part, especially with veggies. It has a nicer feel to it, it looks more natural, and you feel like you're a traditional cook when you're using a wooden cutting board. However, wooden cutting boards have the deficiency that they have a lot of pores in them, and if you're cutting up meat, then, or spicing meat or doing whatever, then the wooden cutting board will absorb the meat juices, and that can grow bacteria, and that can be bad for you. So if you do use a wooden cutting board for meat and fish and so forth, then be careful with it and wash it carefully and take good care of it. But I recommend just using it for veggies these days. And if you choose to do otherwise, that's your choice, of course. Okay, now let's get to the beef. Where's the beef? Okay, it's what's for dinner, right? Or it's actually what's for several nights' dinner, because I am not going to be able to eat one of these steaks in one sitting. There's just no fucking way. Not even with my newly refurbished appetite, which is somewhat better, but still not up to its old standards yet. Hopefully it will get there. Okay, so I got two steaks here. This one has more meat on it, I guess you would say, and this one is a little fattier. This one's also a little larger, and kind of depends on the size of the cooking vessel that I'm going to use for seasoning. So besides how much meat there is on the particular ribeye, and so this one with all the fat is going to go on the grill, and that's today's dry rub. So let's get to the dry rub, and the first thing I'm going to do in this case, and because I'm doing this, it really doesn't matter whether I use the plastic or the wooden cutting board, because I'm going to cover it with products of the Age of Oil. In this case, hard to cut plastic when you're crippled. It's nice to have these products, which of course were not available to people cooking in the good old days, and but they make your life easier, and there's no reason not to use them as long as they're out there, right? It's not going to further degrade the environment. These things are going to be produced whether you use them or not, and I'm going to use them. Okay, so a dry rub is just like what it sounds, right? And I'm not going to rub on everything that I've got that I might put on here. I've got some garlic. I'm not going to chop it up on screen. And I've got some, sun-dried tomatoes that I might use for this, chopped up fine. But, I'll just do the basics here. When you're doing a dry rub, the first thing you want to do is put on a little bit of salt and pepper. Now, not a lot. If you're going to salt it up later, you can always put on more if you like your meat a little salty. If you're going to make it like a peppercorn steak or something like that, again, you would add peppercorns later, crushed peppercorns, crush them up in a mortar and pestle or something like that. The reason for putting on the salt at the beginning is to start to draw some of the juices out of the steak, so that they mix with the dry rub, whatever it is that you're dry rubbing. Pepper. And it also depends on what you're going to use as your seasonings. Some seasonings have these things in them, and in fact most do. So if you're using other seasonings, then you're gonna have to deal with those. So you have to adjust the amount of any of this stuff. Now this is Cajun seasoning, which will perk this sucker up very nicely. So we'll sprinkle some of that on and try to get it on nice and even. And that's when you start to rub. That's why it's called a dry rub, right? You want to rub it into the meat so it sticks. And then I'm going to add, this one is Montreal steak from the McCormick Company. And they make some nice products that are mixtures of a variety of things like onion flakes and garlic and parsley and other good stuff. And so they add a lot of flavor to your steak without you having to do a whole lot of work in terms of, and having to have a huge spice rack, which is a pain in the neck to maintain, and it's also costly. Spices are not cheap even today, and that's why the spice trade with India back in the day of the Silk Road that Pepe Escobar wants to rebuild with Chinese technology we're such a source of fortune for so many people for so many years. The wealthy people of the world in those years wanted these spices, and in fact in those years they were necessary for a large part because food preservation techniques in those days, they didn't have refrigerators, of course. Food preservation techniques required these things if you wanted the food to taste halfway decent after keeping it around a month, you wanted to have the spices for it. Hold on, I'll be right back. Okay, we disposed of some waste. Alright, that's all the dry rub that I'm going to do on this steak. And now what I'm going to do is wrap it up with the dry rub stuff. And it's going to go back in the fridge for a couple hours probably. You don't want to leave it too long with the dry rub because it will get too salty or too much of the flavor of the dry rub in there, and kind of wash out the rest of the flavor of the steak. You want the flavor of the steak to still be in there. And okay, so that one's ready, and we'll go in the fridge for a while. And this one's going to get cooked tonight. The other one will get cooked tomorrow. Okay, in the next part of the ribeye preparations, we're going to take the smaller steak, which almost looks Wagyu on one side. See how much fat there is? We're going to, Wagyu steak, by the way, is the Japanese type of beef, sometimes known as Kobe beef, which if it's Kobe beef, it's Wagyu, but Kobe only comes from the Kobe region of Japan, just like Champagne only comes from the Champagne region of France. You can have lots of sparkling wines, but only one type of sparkling wine from Champagne is Champagne. You know, Kobe beef and Wagyu beef are basically interchangeable. They're both really fatty beef cuts from specially raised and bred beef that is just loaded with fat. Anyway, tomorrow night's prep will be a skillet prep of this particular piece of beef, and what I got to make sure of for that is that it's going to fit inside this container, which I try to make the container size pretty much the same as the cut of meat, so that I don't have to waste too much of my marinade, because my marinade is pretty expensive. I use things like extra virgin olive oil and balsamic vinegar, and in this case, since I'm making a Cabernet sauce, Cabernet wine. And these little bottles that you can get now are really good for cooking, because you don't have to crack open and use a whole bottle of wine to make your sauce or whatever it is that you're making. And you can use better wine than you would use if normally cooking with cooking wine. There's a balance you want to strike in wines that you use for cooking. You don't want the $500 bottle of Chateau Lafite 1941 for cooking even a really good steak. But on the other hand, you don't want cheap cooking wine either. So you look for something in between at a reasonable price. And price is something we got to consider. I will actually do this marinade after the video, not in this video. I don't want to make it too long. You're going to add, maybe a quarter cup of the cooking wine, and an eighth of a cup of the balsamic vinegar, and same with the oil, and then a little soy sauce, and a little maybe hoisin sauce, teriyaki sauce, something else. Whatever strikes your fancy for flavors that you want to infuse into the meat. And that you do leave for a night or even 2 nights overnight in the fridge. And let that stuff soak in and infuse the meat. And I will do that, as I said, afterwards. For right now, I'll just close up the container, which it actually did fit in. I'm quite happy. That's almost a perfect fit. I'll close up the container and put that in the fridge as well.